Eleanor Jennings had always believed in the quiet strength of family. She wasn't loud. She didn't demand attention. She showed her love through small, consistent acts: folding laundry before anyone noticed it was piling up, tending the garden so the children could play on a soft, green lawn, baking muffins and leaving them on the counter without a name tag. She never expected gratitude. She just wanted to belong. At 76, Eleanor had moved in with her son Matthew and his wife, Rachel, after a brief hospitalization following a fall. It was meant to be temporary, just until she fully regained her mobility. Rachel had agreed, albeit hesitantly, and Matthew had assured her, "It'll be good for everyone. You'll see." In the first few weeks, Eleanor kept herself busy. She woke early, prepared breakfast, and made sure Rachel had her favorite herbal tea ready before she left for work. When their son Jamie returned from school, Eleanor greeted him with homemade snacks and helped with homework. She never intruded, never lectured, just supported. But support slowly turned into silence. She began noticing the glances, the way Rachel stiffened when she walked into the kitchen, the way conversations stopped when Eleanor entered the room. The sigh, so faint, but unmistakable whenever she asked a question or made a suggestion. Still, Eleanor stayed gentle. Until one afternoon, everything shifted. Rachel was hosting a small brunch with a few colleagues from her firm. Eleanor had just set down a tray of pastries when Rachel, unaware that Eleanor was still within earshot, laughed lightly and said, "Honestly, I wish she would just vanish. It's exhausting, always having her underfoot." The room went still for a breath. Eleanor didn't move. Matthew was there, her son. The boy she'd raised with bedtime stories and gentle lessons. He didn't correct Rachel. He didn't defend his mother. He didn't even flinch. He just chuckled along with the others and took a sip of his coffee. Eleanor walked away quietly, her fingers still dusted with powdered sugar. She didn't slam a door. She didn't cry in front of anyone. She simply packed a small overnight bag later that evening, left the tray of untouched muffins on the counter, and stepped out into the cool dusk. No note, no explanation, no dramatic goodbye. Just one silent truth taking form in her heart. She was no longer seen as family, but as a burden. And that, more than the fall or the pain in her hip, hurt the most. Eleanor sat alone in the quiet of her room, fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of tea, its steam long gone like so many warm moments she once believed would never fade. The walls around her, once painted with laughter and gratitude, now echoed with sighs and silent dismissal. It hadn't always been this way. In the months following her husband's passing, Eleanor had poured herself into her son's family, not to fill the void, but to pour love where it still had room to grow. She had helped Matthew build his career by caring for the children, preparing meals, folding laundry late into the night. Not once did she ask for anything in return. Her presence in the house had been her way of saying, "You are not alone, we are still a family." She remembered rising before dawn to pack school lunches with little handwritten notes tucked inside, thinking maybe the children would grow up knowing what care looked like in small, consistent ways. She remembered the way Matthew once hugged her in the kitchen, murmuring, "I don't know how we'd do this without you, Mom." That moment, soft and fleeting, felt like a thank you she'd carry for years. But time has a way of reshaping memory, and in Rachel's eyes, Eleanor's intentions began to look like interference. It started subtly. A sigh when Eleanor corrected the children's posture at the dinner table. A tightened smile when she suggested adding salt to the soup. Then came the passive-aggressive remarks. "We like to do things differently now," Rachel would say, her voice polite but her meaning sharp. We, as if Eleanor had become them. Eleanor's holiday meals recipes passed down through generations were now a bit too heavy, or not really what the kids eat these days. The scarf she lovingly knitted for Rachel was dismissed as a bit old-fashioned. Even the way she wrapped birthday gifts carefully, with ribbon and handwritten tags, was replaced by store-bought bags and tags that read, "From all of us." Matthew, always the diplomat, would chuckle and say, "She means well, Mom," as if Eleanor were the problem that needed managing. It wasn't anger Eleanor felt as she recalled those moments. It was something deeper, a quiet grief. The kind that builds not from one betrayal but from many small cuts, the way love is slowly repackaged into guilt, then quietly returned to sender. For so long, she thought she was helping. Now, she was beginning to wonder if all along she had simply been tolerated. If the words from Vanessa had left a hairline fracture in Eleanor's heart, what came next cracked it wide open. A week after that stormy birthday weekend, Eleanor sat quietly in the corner of the living room while Matthew, her son, and Rachel, his wife, chatted over coffee in the adjacent kitchen. They were unaware she was nearby reading, yes, but also listening. She had learned to listen between the silences. Rachel sighed, not in anger, but in a tone laced with frustration and fatigue. "I told you, Matt, it's sweet that she tries, but she always finds a way to step on our toes. The gift she brought for Lily? Almost exactly what we'd planned. It just feels like she's trying too hard to outdo us." Matthew's response came slower, more carefully. "I don't think she means to," he said, but then followed it with something that made Eleanor's spine stiffen. "But yeah, sometimes it feels like she forgets her role. I mean, boundaries matter. She's starting to cross them." Her hands went still in her lap. Role? Boundaries? She wasn't a meddling neighbor or a distant relative barging into their parenting space. She was his mother. The woman who had held him through croupy nights, helped him tie his first tie, sat through school recitals with eyes shining with pride. And now, the act of gifting her granddaughter a thoughtfully chosen dress was interpreted as intrusion. Eleanor didn't move. Her breath was shallow, her gaze fixed on the page before her, though she wasn't reading anymore. A quiet, searing clarity swept through her. This was not just one daughter who had drifted, but both her children had somehow rewritten her place in their lives. She had become an inconvenience wrapped in sentiment. Later that evening, when Matthew casually asked if she was okay, she nodded and smiled. "Just a little tired," she murmured. That was all. No confrontation, no dramatic exit. Just silence. Deliberate silence that allowed space for truth to settle. But inside, something shifted, not out of anger, not even sorrow, just recognition. Her role as a mother, once vibrant and needed, had now been boxed, labeled too much, and placed politely out of reach. They called it setting boundaries. To Eleanor, it felt like exile disguised as courtesy. And so, she began to prepare not for battle, but for departure. Eleanor didn't shout. She didn't call or demand answers. She returned home, drenched not just by the storm, but by the weight of what she had heard. The silence in her own living room felt louder than anything she had ever known. She sat down at the small kitchen table where, just days before, she had written a birthday card for Vanessa. The cake tin was still on the counter, washed and empty, as if the memory of her effort had already been erased. The ache in her chest was not just from betrayal, it was from recognition. She finally saw it. Clearly. Undeniably. Later that evening, she opened the desk drawer where she kept important papers. Among them was a copy of her will, the document her daughter had once insisted on helping organize after Eleanor's surgery. It was supposed to be about peace of mind. But as she flipped through the pages, reading her own handwriting and notes jotted in the margins, something snapped quietly inside her. They weren't just careless with their words, they were waiting, planning, assuming that someday not too far off they would inherit the house. The very walls Eleanor had cared for, the garden Harold had planted, the windows she washed every spring. It wasn't just home to them, it was an asset, a stepping stone. She closed the will and folded it away. No tears, just a calm decision settling into her bones. The next morning, Eleanor made a call. 2 weeks later, the for sale sign went up in front of the house. Neighbors were surprised. Some whispered. Others asked if she was downsizing. Eleanor only smiled and said, "I'm making room for something better." No one needed to know the truth. The house sold faster than anyone expected. It had charm, history, and a seller who didn't cling. Eleanor packed quietly, one box at a time, donating what she didn't need, gifting heirlooms to neighbors who had shown kindness over the years. The rest? Left behind, like a chapter carefully closed. With the money from the sale, she didn't move closer to Vanessa. She moved farther, to a town by the coast, where no one knew her as just a mother or just a widow. She rented a small, sun-filled apartment with a balcony facing the sea. Eleanor hadn't disappeared. She had simply chosen to be seen in her own terms. Angela didn't notice right away. Margaret's room still smelled faintly of lavender, and her cardigan was still draped across the armchair, just as it always had been. But by the second evening, something shifted. The house, usually humming with the low, reliable rhythm of her mother's quiet contributions, felt heavier, as if something vital had been unplugged. At first, Angela assumed Margaret had gone for a walk, or perhaps stayed with a friend overnight. But by the third day, when the laundry piled up, when dinner hadn't cooked itself, when little Jake's homework remained unchecked, and Abby's tantrums went unanswered, the silence became undeniable. Derek frowned at the bills on the counter. "Did your mom handle the water and groceries this month?" he asked. Angela blinked. "She usually does. She used to." Her voice trailed off as the realization landed. Used to. The house had always run like clockwork because Margaret had been the one quietly winding it, without recognition, without complaint. She folded laundry that wasn't hers. She prepped dinner while babysitting. She slipped grocery receipts into her own purse instead of asking for reimbursement. She even helped cover utilities disguised as a little help from her retirement check. Now, without her presence, the air was sharper, colder, less forgiving. Angela began calling. Once, then twice, then 5 times in one afternoon. Texts followed. "Mom, are you okay? Where are you? We need to talk." There were no answers. She sent Derek to her mother's old apartment building, only to be met with a new name on the mailbox. The woman there, a kind nurse named Rena, simply said, "The previous tenant moved out quietly, very polite lady, left the place spotless." Angela was stunned. Her mother, who had limped her way into their home after a fall, who had blended so seamlessly into the fabric of their day, had vanished without so much as a goodbye. Then, one evening, a letter arrived, handwritten in her mother's careful, slanted script. "Angela, I didn't disappear. I withdrew from a place where love had become transactional and respect was optional. I didn't leave because I stopped caring. I left because I started caring about myself, too. Love, Mom." Angela read it twice, then a third time, her eyes clouded with something she hadn't felt in years. Shame, maybe. Or was it grief? Not for a death, but for a fracture she had never thought possible. A gap not caused by an argument, but by accumulation of small dismissals, of offhand jokes, of quiet ingratitude. Without Margaret, the house still functioned, technically, but it no longer felt like home. The warmth was gone. The unspoken glue that held their days together had quietly taken her leave, and suddenly, everything began to come undone. Angela looked around at the family she'd worked so hard to build, and for the first time, she realized what they had lost wasn't convenience. It was grace, patience, steady, uncelebrated love. The kind that didn't ask for credit, but always deserved it. It was a Thursday morning when Margaret's phone began to buzz. Once, twice, then steadily calls from Angela and Derek, back to back like waves trying to reach a shore long since pulled away. They had finally noticed. Not the absence of her folded laundry on the couch or her quiet footsteps in the hallway. Not the missing cups of tea, the soup simmering after long days, the patient presence that bridged their chaos. But the cold silence of her withdrawal land, the abrupt freeze in their household finances. The money had stopped. The babysitting had stopped. The convenience of having someone always available had vanished, and with it, their sense of control. Angela's voicemail was tearful. "Mom, we're sorry. Just please call me back. We didn't mean anything by it. We've just been stressed." Derek's message was shorter, sterner. "You can't just walk away like this. At least talk to us. We're family." For 3 days, Margaret said nothing. She tended to her rooftop garden at the well house, helping Mrs. Simmons repot her lavender. She hosted tea with her tenants, laughing softly as a new resident played Chopin on a second-hand keyboard. And then, on the 4th morning, she agreed to meet. The cafe was quiet. She chose a table by the window, sunlight catching in the rim of her teacup. When Angela and Derek arrived, they looked older not from age, but from panic. Realization does that to people. Angela sat first, wringing her hands. Derek stayed standing until Margaret gestured calmly for him to sit. "I can't believe you just left," Angela said, her voice trembling. Margaret smiled gently. "I didn't leave, darling. I stepped away. From a place where my presence had become invisible, where my love was mistaken for obligation." Derek opened his mouth, but Margaret lifted a hand. "This isn't punishment," she said quietly. "It's consequence. When you treat someone as a convenience, eventually they remember their worth." Angela's eyes brimmed with tears. "We didn't realize." "You did," Margaret replied, not unkindly. "But you chose not to see, until it no longer served you." They sat in silence, the weight of truth settling heavier than any scolding. Margaret sipped her tea. "I'm not angry, just done accepting less than respect." And with that, she stood. A quiet farewell. A beginning born not from bitterness, but from finally choosing herself. It wasn't an apology over flowers or a dramatic reunion in the rain. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. The kind when sunlight drapes across the kitchen counter and the world feels still enough to breathe honestly. Matthew sat with his hands folded tightly, as if holding something fragile inside him. Rachel stirred her tea, silent but visibly unsettled. Across from them, Eleanor watched without judgment, only the calm steadiness of someone who had already walked through the storm and found a clearing. "I think we owe you more than just a sorry," Matthew began. "Where Rachel and we didn't see things clearly. We were counting on more than we should have." He glanced at his wife. Rachel nodded, eyes still low. "We assumed," she said. "We expected help, inheritance. We acted like it was all owed to us because you're family. But that wasn't love. That was convenience." Eleanor didn't interrupt. She let the words land. Matthew's voice was softer now. "It wasn't just financial. We leaned on you emotionally too, expected you to always be there. Never asked how you were, never wondered if you were tired. And when you finally pulled away," Rachel added, "we panicked. Not because we lost you, but because we lost the comfort you gave us." Eleanor exhaled slowly, not with anger, but with release. "Thank you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "For naming it. That matters." She paused, then continued. "I have my part too. I spent years trying to stay needed. I didn't see how often I crossed lines offering help that wasn't asked for, calling too often, worrying too much. Maybe it felt like control to you. I see that now." There was silence again, but it was no longer tense. It was necessary room for honesty to take root. "So where do we go from here?" Matthew asked. "We stop expecting each other to fit old roles," Eleanor replied. "No more silent debts. No more invisible contracts. If I offer something, it's out of love and not duty. And if you decline, that's okay." Rachel looked up finally. "And if we want to rebuild this, for real, then we start with boundaries," Eleanor said. "And respect. We talk. We listen. We ask, instead of assuming." They all nodded, a fragile understanding blooming between them. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was real. Sometimes, healing doesn't come from grand gestures but from conversations that are finally honest. Time has a quiet way of softening even the deepest aches. Months had passed since Margaret stepped away from the house where she had once been invisible. She had not disappeared, she had redefined her presence. Angela and Derek eventually reached out, not with apologies dressed in panic, but with cautious messages filled with a different toneless expectation, more consideration. The calls became less frequent, but more sincere. No longer were they about what Margaret could do for them, but rather asking how she was, where she was heading next. Margaret answered when she wanted to. She didn't avoid them, she simply engaged on her own terms. For the first time in years, she wasn't tethered to anyone's schedule, guilt, or unspoken obligation. She was, finally, free. With her modest apartment at the Well House now fully furnished with items she'd chosen for herself, she began exploring corners of life she had long shelved. She joined a travel group for seniors and took a train to the coast, where she sat for hours sketching seagulls and waves. She enrolled in an oil painting class, even though she still smudged every horizon line. She read books for pleasure again, not to fall asleep or escape, but to feel alive. The rooftop garden she helped plant with the other women at the well house flourished just like the women themselves. Lavender, thyme, and cherry tomatoes spilled over the boxes, watered not only by rain but by shared stories, soft laughter, and moments of healing. Every Wednesday evening, Margaret hosted Tea Tales, a gathering where women of all ages came to sip chamomile and share pieces of their lives without judgment. One day, a card arrived in the mail, written in crayon by her oldest granddaughter. "Grandma, can you come on our trip and be our tour guide? Mommy said you know the best stories." Margaret smiled. It wasn't an invitation out of obligation, it was a gesture born of affection. She accepted, with grace. That summer, Margaret stood at the front of a rented tour bus, pointing out landmarks with a map in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Her grandchildren leaned in eagerly. Angela sat quietly, watching her mother with new eyes, not as a burden, but as a woman of strength, story, and soul. Margaret hadn't reclaimed her old place in the family. She had created a new one on her own terms. And in that space, love finally had room to breathe.